The Kingdom of England. Well, of course, there are different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before that, and Rome before that, but we gotta start somewhere. Technically, the first English king is Alfred the Great, even though he was technically only king of Wessex. That's West Saxon with an E. He was pretty great because he modernized the things, actually translated stuff into languages people actually read instead of Latin. But important for this video, he dealt with the Vikings by just sharing England. It became his eldest son Edward the Elder, and then his son Ethelstan, who kicked the Vikings out and was the first actual king of the English. His two brothers and two nephews. Then Edward II the Martyr was assassinated, so the crown passed to his brother Ethelred the Unready, who was unready to find out that his name was a pun. Also, the Vikings are back. Ethelred got the crown back for a few years. His first son, Edmund II Ironside, kicked some butt for a while until he was assassinated on a toilet. So the guy from Denmark's son, Canute, put a ring on Ethelred's widow. He was considered great because he had Denmark, Norway, and England forming the North Sea Empire, which wasn't what it was actually called at the time. Canute had two half-English kids. Most people wanted Harthacnut Canute to succeed him, so instead his older brother Harold. But it doesn't matter because neither of them had kids, so the throne passed back to Harthacnut Canute's half-brother, Edmund the Confessor. Ed III did keep the peace and all, but he was also an asexual, bookish nerd, so he didn't have any kids. So the crown passed to his brother-in-law, Harald Godwinson. As approved by the Witan, a council of nobles, Harald Godwinson didn't have a whole lot of time to do something because 1066 was the most important date in English history. The King of Norway, who is also named Harald, but with two A's, Harald Sigurdsson, or Harald Hardrada, which means hard rule, might just be the most interesting man in the world. He fought in a battle when he was only 15 years old, went into exile with his half-brother, became a Varangian Guard, which is the overpowered Viking modern Praetorian Guard to the modern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. He fought in Sicily and Armenia, made it all the way down to the Holy Land, and supposedly all the way down to Abyssinia, married a Russian princess, made it back home and became king, tried conquering Denmark and failed. It might as well be Harold III of Norway and Harold III of England. And he was supported by Godwinson's brother Tostig. The former Jarl of Northumbria basically invited Harold to get his throne against his brother. Meanwhile, in France, the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, decided he should also be king of England, because his aunt married Ethelred and Canute. Supported by the Pope because England wasn't Catholic enough for Europe, and an army of heavy cavalry. So now we have three people trying to be the king of England, all of which with great facial hair. Godwinson was more scared of the Bastard of Normandy, so had troops lining the coastline. William landed in Piversea and dealt with a small battle, but this was just a distraction because as he marched north, Godwinson got word and everyone met up near Leeds, ambushing William. The Norman and English clashed. There was a tapestry made of it, and William unceremoniously fell off his horse. He got on a second horse, which also tossed him off, and then the English disemboweled him. The army scattered or joined the English. William's two young sons inherited Normandy, but both of them died under mysterious circumstances, and Normandy was divided between all the major powers. Many Normans fled to southern Italy, which was ruled by a Norman king at the time, but even more fled up to Great Britain, which drastically changed the English language. Hardrada landed in the Orkney Islands a little later than he wanted to, but he finally made it to England at the same time as the Battle of William, in Whitby, supplied by 2,700 mercenaries from Scotland and Flanders. Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria heard what was going on and attacked at the Battle of Scarborough. They were completely wiped out by the army led by Berserker Turgal Sturgen, the future Jarl of Mercia. Very quickly, the Norwegians were able to capture York, the former heartland of Norse and England. Harold Godwinson heard and somehow marched all the way north very quickly, which led to the Battle of Tick Hill, where famously Harold Godwinson, his eldest son Godwin, and his other son Edmund were killed on the field of battle by arrows. Tostig was re-established as the Jarl of Northumbria, and the Hardrada dynasty was crowned king of England and York, which was made the new capital. The southern lords did not like this at all, so the Witan elected Edgar Etheling, a descendant of Edmund Ironside, which started a small rebellion that was put down by Hardrada. But that was truly his final war because he died in 1074 from natural causes, so his son Magnus became king of England and Norway, marrying Silesia of Normandy to lock down that royal legitimacy. But it wasn't enough for the southern lords, which started another rebellion, which caused kind of a Danelaw England situation. The Witan elected Harold Godwinson's son Magnus, which no, it's not confusing at all that there's two people at the same time named Magnus Haraldsson trying to be king of England. Especially because Magnus Godwinson was killed at the Battle of Bath, and Magnus Hardrada was only killed from injuries from the Battle of Bath. Magnus was succeeded by his brother Olaf, the first and third of Norway. He married his brother's widow, and he was actually kind of a good king, and people really liked him because he was known as the Peaceful. The Norse actually really loved English culture and kept it around, and even gave it a lot of rights, allowed a lot of English lords to keep their land. He even decided to import a lot of English people to Norway to develop a lot of the coastal cities, which increased trade. Which notably from this time, the city of Oslo became really big. Olaf's son Magnus II didn't believe in a whole peace thing, so he kicked Scotland out of England, conquered the Isle of Man and the Kingdom of the Isles, and even conquered the Kingdom of Dublin, which was basically every city in Ireland. And yes, book fans know that this is the very same Magnus Redblade. Magnus Godwinson had 3 kids, Walder, who died in prison, Godgief, who married the future King of Scotland, and Steed, who was only an infant when his father rebelled. And yes, that's the very same Steed who's known as the Outlaw Prince. You know, the whole take from the rich, give to the poor, may have not really existed, yada yada. Back with Magnus II. The Pope hated him, but it was fine because England at this point was basically Orthodox in all but name. And that was because Harald Hardrada spent most of his adult life out east. And yes, the Scandinavians have been Christian since the time of Alfred the Great, but they were also still clinging on to a lot of their old Norse Ossetrus ways, like having tons of concubines and considering those kids as legitimate as their married kids. So Magnus had 4 sons of concubines, 3 of which became co-kings with each other, Olaf II, Eystein, and Sigurd, and that is the very famous Sigurd the Crusader who led the crusading forces personally. Sigurd married his aunt and tried having that kid Canute rule with his other son Magnus III, but the two hated each other and poisoned each other, which led to Norway having an on-again, off-again civil war between disputed children for 100 years. England was saved from it because Magnus Redblade's son Harold was overthrown by the King of Scotland David, who crowned himself King of England. The throne then passed over his dead son Henry, that was the new Jarl of Northumbria after the ousting of Tostig IV, to his eldest grandchild Malcolm IV, who was known as the Maiden for, reasons. They died young, so the throne passed to their brother William I, known as the Lion, and that's why England and Scotland's coat of arms are lions. Then it passed to Alexander I and II, or Alistair II and III, but Al's son died before him, and so did his daughter Margaret, but her husband, who was the King of Norway after all that fighting, Eric II, became Eric I. But Eric didn't have any more kids, so it passed to his only daughter Margaret, who became queen at sweet 16. And spent most of that time defending her throne from her uncle Haakon. Margaret didn't live that much longer after, because in 1320 she ended up having a complicated pregnancy, so the throne ended up actually passing to Haakon's grandson Magnus, the 4th of Sweden and England, and 7th of Norway, and 0 of Scotland because a distant relative of Margaret named Robert de Bruce ended up winning independence. The crown of Sweden then passed to Magnus' son Eric XII, who didn't have any kids, so it passed to a nephew, Albert, while England-Norway got Haakon I and VI, who married a woman named Margaret and had a son named Olaf, the 2nd of Denmark and 4th of Norway and England. But he died young, so his mom, who was already just the regent, became Queen Margaret, the 2nd of England and 1st of everywhere else, especially because the nobles basically just invited Margaret to overthrow the unpopular Albert. Some people will call this the Second North Sea Empire, but at the time it was actually just known as the Kalmar Union, where all Scandinavia, Ireland, and England was all united. You can also call this the Kingdom of the Northern Lion because everyone's coat of arms was a lion. In 1400, tax collectors who were going to Greenland were accidentally blown off course to modern-day Norvik and accidentally rediscovered Vineland and Markland and discovered there was a whole new continent called Elfenheim. Meanwhile, Margaret didn't have any more kids, so the throne passed to her nephew, Eric, of Pomerania, the 2nd of England, 3rd of Norway, 7th of Denmark, and 13th of Sweden. But then Eric didn't have any kids that lived, so it passed to his nephew, Christopher, the 3rd of Denmark, and 1st of everywhere else. And he didn't have any kids, so it passed to a dude named Christian, which is different from Christopher because shut up. But he also has some legitimacy distantly in Denmark. Chris decided to split the throne by giving England to his eldest son John, and his second son Frederick got Denmark-Norway. And then he ended up getting England anyway because Christian II didn't have any kids that lived. It was in exchange for Swedish independence. Then came Christian III of England and II of Denmark, insert Martin Luther here. Then Frederick II, Christian IV and III, and Frederick III, where we run into some issues because Frederick was an absolutist who believed in divine right, that he was appointed by God to rule these lands. He abolished the English Witan. The English hated that shit, which started the English Civil War, which resulted in Frederick being blinded and kicked out of England. And Edward IV Fairfax became the new king, a puritanical man who famously banned Christmas and conquered Wales from Louis XIII, and committed what would today be considered genocide over Welsh and Irish people. His son Ethan I didn't have any amount of charisma, so the English Parliament just invited Christian V, who agreed to a parliamentary system and agreed to leave the country when his father died 2 years later, and the throne passed to his brother in England, George, which had its own problems, not because of George himself, but because of his wife, Anne. Because after Robert the Bruce, the throne passed to the Stuart family, and there was a pretty safe line of Seamuses, until Mary Queen of Scots was overthrown by her council, who raised her only child, Seamus VI, to be a Protestant during the long Scottish War of Religion. Then the Second War of Scottish Religion came when Charles I was overthrown by Mary's adopted son, Duncan III, who was Catholic, but he had no sons, so the throne passed to Charles I's son, Charles II, then to his brother Seamus VII, who remarried to Duncan's daughter, who ended up converting him to be Catholic, which was unpopular in Scotland. The Third War of Religion was more or less just they invited his Protestant daughter, who was ironically named Mary II, to just walk in and take the throne. She ruled together with William II, who was her cousin husband, but they didn't have any kids, so the Scottish throne ended up passing to her sister Anne. But hey, Anne got double legitimacy because she's a descendant of Christian IV's sister. There's a lot of speculation that George and Anne would rule together, like Mary and William, but they decided to keep the throne separate. They were hoping to have 2 sons to give to Scotland and England, but George died from an asthma attack, and their only surviving child was William, who became King of England at 19, and 10 years later after his mom, Scotland. Unlike his parents, he decided to pass the Act of Union, which created the United Kingdoms of Great Britain. William I ruled for 76 years. It got up to some important stuff, like marrying a French noblewoman who was probably Jewish, making high heels fashionable in England, playing the hurdy-durdy, having about 15 illegitimate kids, establishing England's largest colony in the New World, New South Wales, Sir Robert Walpole becoming the first Prime Minister of the UK. He actually allied with Sweden in the Great Northern War, mostly because Poland ended up electing Seamus VII as James I and his son James II of Poland, leading to several wars for their claimants. And William is also the namesake for an island which later was established Australia. Throne passed to his grandson George II, who only ruled for a month, then to William, George William, Malcolm William. Then came Christian VI, who was crowned only 2 months before the Third Franco-Prussian War, and ruled all the way until 1980, where he died from a bladder infection. His only son Malcolm died in 1977 in a car accident when England was trying to move from driving on the left to right. So the throne passed to his only living child, Mary. Mary, ironically, was given word that she was now the Queen of England a day after her wedding to her third cousin, Christian, of Greece and Denmark. It was pretty clear even early on the two didn't really get along, which was strange because most people ended up getting along pretty well with Mary, from the commons to the royals, being known as the People's Queen due to her down-to-earth nature. She got a divorce in the mid-80s and got remarried to her best friend, the famous musician, Freddie Hermes, who both famously snuck out to go to parties. Conservatives hated their eccentric lifestyle, and for other reasons due to Freddie, but it doesn't matter because they were still wed. Mary is 64 and is in incredible health, so she's not going to be gone quite yet. But when it is her time, the throne will then pass to her eldest son, Frederick IV, or to one of his sons, either Malcolm III or Omar I. The Equal Inheritance Rights Act only applies to kids born after 2012, so both Kimberly and Mary have to wait until after their younger brother Austin and his son Houston. Mary had a daughter named Gia of Constantine that's technically older than all of her kids with Freddie, and many in the political party UKIP want her to be the queen over Frederick. But much like Mary, Constantine accidentally became the emperor of the Byzantines, so Gia has renounced her claim to England. But what do you guys think? You think that the English kings are interesting? Who's your favorite? Let me know in the comments below, as well as hitting the like button and subscribing for more.